My name is Nora, and I'll never forget the day my Aunt Lillian stood in my grandmother's oak-paneled living room, her voice slicing through the air like a blade, saying, "You're useless, Nora. You have no place in this family's legacy." I was 24, standing in the doorway, my hands trembling, as my aunts, uncles, and cousins nodded in agreement, their eyes cold and unyielding. They'd gathered for the reading of Grandma Rose's will, a woman I'd loved with every piece of my heart, and they'd barred me from it as if I were a stranger, not her granddaughter. The word useless wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict, a brand seared into my soul, confirming every fear I'd ever had that I wasn't enough. Let me take you back to where it all began, because to understand the weight of that moment, you need to know who I was, before they tried to erase me. I grew up in a small coastal town called Harborview, where the salt air clung to everything and the houses were modest, weathered by storms and time. My mom was a school teacher, her days filled with lesson plans and grading papers, her nights with stories she'd read to me from tattered library books. My dad was a fisherman, his hands rough from nets and ropes, his smile a rare gift after long days at sea. We didn't have much. Our house was a 2-bedroom cottage, the paint peeling, the roof leaking. When the rains came, but we had each other. Mom would braid my hair and tell me I could be anything, and Dad would point to the stars over the ocean and say, "That's your future, Nora, big and bright." Grandma Rose was the heart of our family, or so I thought. She lived in a grand old house on the edge of town, a place that felt like a castle to me as a child, with its creaky floors and walls lined with family portraits. She was my dad's mom, a widow, with a sharp mind and a laugh that could chase away any shadow. Grandma ran a small antique bookstore, a treasure trove of dusty tomes and forgotten stories, and I spent my summers there shelving books and listening to her tales of the world beyond Harborview. She'd slip me extra cookies and whisper, "You're my special girl, Nora. You've got a spark nobody can dim." I believed her, clung to her words like a lifeline, especially when the rest of the family started to pull away. See, my dad was the black sheep, the son who'd chosen a fisherman's life over the family's expectations. Grandma's other children, my Aunt Lillian, Aunt Margaret, and Uncle Thomas, had gone to college, built careers in law, finance, and real estate. They lived in cities, drove sleek cars, and wore clothes that cost more than my parents' monthly rent. Their kids, my cousins, were polished and ambitious, always talking about internships and Ivy League schools. I was the odd one out, the girl in hand-me-downs, who loved books and dreamed of starting a publishing company someday, a dream I'd shared with Grandma over countless cups of tea. My aunts and uncles tolerated me at family gatherings, but their smiles were thin, their questions about my future laced with pity. Still working at that bookstore, they'd ask as if it were a dead end, not a passion. Things got worse after Dad died. I was 16, and a storm took his boat, leaving Mom and me to pick up the pieces. Grandma was there, her arms around us, her bookstore a refuge when the grief felt too heavy. But Lillian, Margaret, and Thomas grew colder, visiting less, calling only to ask about Grandma's health or her finances. They'd whisper about the estate when they thought I wasn't listening, their eyes glinting with something I didn't yet understand. Mom tried to shield me, but I saw the strain in her, the way she worked extra hours to keep us afloat. I threw myself into school, earning a partial scholarship to a local college, determined to make her proud. I majored in literature, worked nights at a diner to cover my fees, and kept dreaming of that publishing company, a way to honor Grandma's love for stories. Grandma's health started failing when I was 22, a slow decline that broke my heart. I'd drive to her house every weekend, reading to her from her favorite novels, her hand frail but warm in mine. She'd talk about the past, about the trust she'd set up, years ago, a fund she'd built, from selling rare books and investments. "It's for the family," she'd say, but her eyes would linger on me like she meant something more. I didn't think much of it, I just wanted her to be okay. When she passed a year later, I was shattered. I stood at her funeral, clutching Mom's hand while my aunts and uncles wept crocodile tears, their faces perfect masks of grief. I didn't know then that they'd already started plotting that they saw Grandma's death as an opportunity, not a loss. The will reading was set for a month later at Grandma's house, now shuttered and silent without her. I wasn't invited. Lillian called me the day before her voice clipped. "This is a family matter, Nora. You'd only be in the way." I protested my throat tight, but she hung up. Mom was furious, ready to drive me there herself, but she was recovering from a bad flu, and I couldn't let her risk it. So I went alone, my old hatchback rattling as I pulled into the driveway. The house was full of relatives, their voices hushed but sharp like vultures circling. When I stepped inside, Lillian blocked my path, her words, "You're useless, Nora," hitting like a slap. My cousins smirked, Uncle Thomas shook his head, and Aunt Margaret said, "Go home, dear. This isn't for you." I stood there frozen, my heart cracking under the weight of their rejection. They didn't just want Grandma's money, they wanted to erase me from her story. I drove home in tears, the road blurring my hands, gripping the wheel, so tight my knuckles ached. Mom held me when I got back, her voice fierce. "You're not useless, Nora. You're everything." But I couldn't shake the shame, the sense that I'd failed Grandma, that I'd let her down by not fighting harder. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, the walls still papered with my teenage sketches of book covers. I thought about Grandma, her belief in my spark, her stories that had taught me the world was bigger than Harborview. Somewhere in the quiet of that pain, a resolve took root. I wasn't going to let them define me. I was going to prove them wrong, not just for me, but for Grandma, for Mom, for the girl I'd been before they tried to break her. Have you ever been told you're not enough, that you don't belong? How did you keep going when the people who should love you turned away? For me, it was Grandma's voice in my head whispering that I had a spark, and the promise I made to myself. That night, I'd show them all what useless could do. The days after that humiliating scene at Grandma's house were a fog of grief and rage. I'd wake up each morning with Lillian's words, "You're useless, Nora," ringing in my ears, a wound that refused to heal. I was back in Harborview, living with Mom in our little cottage, the walls closing in as I tried to make sense of my family's betrayal. Grandma's death had already left a hole in my heart, but being shut out of her will, dismissed like I was nothing, felt like losing her all over again. I'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of condolence cards we'd received, wondering how a family could mourn together, yet tear one of their own apart. Mom saw the change in me, the way my laughter had gone quiet, my eyes dull with hurt. "They're wrong about you, Nora," she'd say, her voice fierce but soft, her hand squeezing mine. But believing her was harder than it used to be. I was still working at the diner, picking up extra shifts to help with Mom's bills. The work was grueling, greasy plates, rude customers' nights, that left my feet aching, but it was honest and it kept me moving. I'd smile for the regulars, pour coffee, with a steady hand, but inside I was crumbling. Every tip I stuffed into my apron felt like a reminder of how little I had, how far I was from the dreams I'd shared with Grandma. I'd wanted to start a publishing company, to bring stories like hers to the world, but now that felt like a child's fantasy, something my aunts and uncles would laugh at if they knew. I started avoiding mirrors, afraid of the defeated girl I'd see staring back. One evening, as I wiped down the diner's counter, a familiar face walked in. Mrs. Delaney, my high school English teacher. She was in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that could spot a lie from across a room. She'd been the one who'd pushed me to apply for that college scholarship, who'd told me my essays were magic on the page. I hadn't seen her since graduation, and I felt a pang of shame as she sat at the counter, her gaze warm but searching. "Nora, my girl," she said, her voice like a hug. "What's got you looking like the world's on your shoulders?" I tried to brush it off, but Mrs. Delaney wasn't one for dodging. Over a slice of pie, I spilled everything the will. Lillian's words, the way my family had made me feel like I didn't belong. She listened, her face softening with understanding. And when I finished, she leaned forward, her voice firm. "Nora, you're not useless. You're a storyteller, and the world needs your voice. Don't let their smallness steal that from you." Her words were a spark, faint but stubborn, in the darkness of my hurt. Mrs. Delaney didn't stop there. She told me about a part-time job at the local library cataloging books and helping with community programs. "It's not glamorous," she said, "but it's a start, and it's closer to your heart than this diner." I hesitated, afraid to hope, but the next day I applied. The library hired me on the spot, and I cut back my diner shifts, trading greasy aprons for quiet stacks of books. The work was soothing, each book a reminder of Grandma's bookstore, her belief in stories as a way to change the world. I started reading again, devouring novels and memoirs, letting their words stitch me back together. Mom was my anchor through it all. She'd come home from teaching, her arms full of papers, and find me curled up with a book, a notebook open beside me. I'd started writing again, not stories but ideas, fragments of a plan to start that publishing company. Mom would peek at my notes and smile. "That's my girl," she'd say. Her pride a quiet strength, but she was struggling too. Her school was cutting hours, and the cottage's mortgage was a constant weight. I wanted to help, to take the burden off her, but my library job paid just enough to cover my own expenses. The guilt gnawed at me, a reminder of how powerless I felt, how far I was from proving my family wrong. Then came a small, unexpected lifeline. One afternoon, while shelving books, I overheard a library patron talking about a local writing contest sponsored by a small press in the city. The prize was $2,000 and a chance to pitch a book idea to their editors. My heart raced. I hadn't written anything serious since college, but Mrs. Delaney's words echoed in my mind. "The world needs your voice." That night, I stayed up late, drafting a short story about a girl from a fishing town who finds her strength after loss, a story that was half me, half Grandma. I poured my heart into it, every word a defiance of Lillian's verdict. Submitting it felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying but freeing. Weeks later, I got the call I'd won. The $2,000 was a godsend, enough to cover Mom's mortgage for a few months. But the real prize was the pitch meeting. I drove to the city, my hands sweaty on the wheel, and sat across from an editor named Carla, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I pitched my idea for a publishing company, one that would focus on stories from overlooked voices, small-town dreamers, working-class heroes, people like me and Grandma. Carla listened, nodding, then said, "You've got fire, Nora. Start small but don't stop." She offered me a freelance gig editing manuscripts for $500 a pop and connected me with a local writers group. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a door, one I hadn't dared hope for. I threw myself into the work, editing by night, shelving books by day, saving every penny from the freelance gigs. I bought a used laptop, set up a corner of my bedroom as an office, and started researching small business grants. The anger I'd felt at my family's rejection was still there, but it was changing, turning into something sharper, more focused. I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to build something they couldn't ignore. I thought about Grandma, her trust, the way she'd looked at me, like I was her legacy. I didn't know what she'd left behind, but I knew she'd believed in me, and that was enough to keep me going. But the pain didn't vanish. One evening, Mom got a call from Aunt Margaret, asking about Grandma's old bookstore, which had been shuttered since her death. "We're selling it," Margaret said, her voice cold through the speakerphone. "No need to involve Nora, she's got nothing to do with it." I overheard my stomach twisting. The bookstore was Grandma's heart, my childhood haven, and they were erasing it without a thought. Mom hung up her face tight, and I saw my own hurt mirrored in her eyes. "They can't take her from you," she said, pulling me into a hug. But they were trying, and it lit a fire in me, a determination to reclaim what they thought they could steal. I started digging, not sure what I was looking for. I visited the county records office, pulling files on Grandma's estate, her bookstore, anything that might give me a clue. Most of it was locked behind legal jargon, but I found a reference to a trust, the one Grandma had mentioned in her final days. It was a whisper of hope, a thread I tucked away, not knowing how it would unravel. For now, I had my writing, my freelance work, and a spark that refused to die. I was broken, yes, but I was also rebuilding piece by painful piece, and I wasn't going to let them win. Have you ever felt like the world was trying to erase you to make you disappear? What was the first step you took to fight back? For me, it was that story, that $2,000 prize, and the belief that Grandma's spark in me was still alive, waiting to burn, brighter than they could ever imagine. The months that followed the writing contest win were a blur of small victories and stubborn hope. But the sting of my family's rejection never fully faded. Lillian's voice, "You're useless." Nora haunted me, creeping into my quiet moments, making me question every step I took. I was 24, still living with Mom in our creaky cottage in Harborview. My days split between the library and freelance editing gigs. The $2,000 prize had eased Mom's mortgage for a while, but money was tight again, and the weight of our bills pressed harder each month. I'd lie awake at night, Ellie's old stuffed whale clutched in my hands, a gift from Grandma that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, wondering if I was fooling myself, chasing a dream my family had already declared worthless. The library job was my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of shelving books, their pages whispering stories that felt more like home than my family ever had. My coworkers were kind, a mix of retirees and college students who didn't ask too many questions. But it was Mrs. Delaney who kept me grounded. She'd drop by the library once a week, always with a new book recommendation or a gentle nudge to keep writing. One afternoon, she caught me scribbling publishing company ideas in a notebook during my break, my coffee gone cold. "You're still dreaming big, I see," she said, her eyes twinkling. I shrugged, embarrassed. "It's just ideas, nothing real." She leaned closer, her voice firm. "Dreams start as ideas, Nora. Don't let anyone make you think they're not real." Her encouragement was a lifeline, but it couldn't shield me from the world outside. Mom's school had cut her hours again, and she was picking up tutoring jobs to make ends meet. I saw the exhaustion in her, the way her shoulders slumped when she thought I wasn't looking. I tried to help funneling my freelance earnings, $500 here, $700 there, into our household, but it was never enough. The guilt was a constant ache, a reminder that I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for her, for the sacrifices she'd made to raise me. I started taking on more editing work, staying up until dawn, to meet deadlines, my eyes burning from the laptop's glare. Each job was a step towards something bigger, a publishing company I called Rose Press. In my mind, a tribute to Grandma's love for stories. Carla, the editor from the writing contest, became an unexpected ally. She sent me steady freelance work manuscripts from new authors that needed polishing. We'd talk on the phone sometimes, her voice crackling with energy, as she shared stories of her own struggles in publishing. "It's a tough industry, Nora," she said one evening, "but you've got grit. That's worth more than a fancy degree." She introduced me to an online network of women in publishing, a group of editors, writers, and small press owners who swapped tips and opportunities. It was a world I'd only glimpsed in my dreams, and being part of it, even on the edges, made me feel like I was moving forward, not just surviving. But forward didn't mean easy. One gray morning, I got a letter from Aunt Lillian, forwarded from Grandma's estate lawyer. It was a formal notice that the family was selling Grandma's bookstore with proceeds to be split among eligible heirs. My name wasn't listed. The words blurred as tears stung my eyes, not just for the money, but for the bookstore itself, the place where I'd spent my childhood, where Grandma had taught me to love stories. They were erasing her legacy and mine without a second thought. I showed the letter to Mom, my hands shaking. "They can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. Mom's face hardened, but her voice was steady. "They can, but you don't have to let them define you. You're Rose's granddaughter, Nora. That's your inheritance, not their scraps." Her words lit a fire in me, one that burned hotter than my grief. I went back to the county records office, digging deeper into Grandma's trust. The librarian there, a kind woman named Ellen, helped me navigate the files, pointing out references to a Rose Harlan trust that hadn't been fully disclosed at the will reading. The details were vague bank accounts, investments, properties, but there was a clause about a designated heir to be revealed under specific conditions. I didn't know what it meant, but it was a thread, and I clung to it. I started emailing lawyers, asking about trusts and estates, most of them brushing me off until I found Rachel, a young attorney who worked pro bono for women in tough spots. She agreed to look into the trust, warning me it could take months. "Keep fighting, Nora," she said. "You're onto something." Fighting meant working harder, dreaming bigger. I applied for a $5,000 small business grant, pouring my heart into a proposal for Rose Press, a company that would publish stories from voices like mine, small-town working class, overlooked. Writing it felt like telling Grandma's story and mine to the world. I didn't tell Mom, not wanting to get her hopes up, but Mrs. Delaney saw the application draft on my desk one day and grinned. "That's the spark I was talking about," she said. "You're going to make Rose proud." Her belief, like Mom's, was a shield against the doubt that crept in when I was alone. My family didn't stop their campaign to diminish me. One evening, I ran into my cousin Sophie at the grocery store, her cart full of organic produce, her nails perfect. She was Lillian's daughter, a lawyer like her mom, and she'd been at the will reading, smirking as I was turned away. "Heard you're still at the library," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "Guess some people never move up." I wanted to scream to tell her about the grant, the freelance work, the trust I was chasing, but I just knotted my jaw tight. "Guess not," I said, and walked away, my heart pounding. Her words hurt, but they also fueled me, a reminder of why I was fighting. The grant came through a month later, a $5,000 check that felt like a miracle. I cried when I opened the letter alone in my bedroom. Ellie the whale tucked beside me. It wasn't enough to start a company, but it was a foundation money for a website, editing software, maybe a small marketing push. I called Carla, who cheered like I'd won the lottery, and she connected me with a web designer who worked cheap for new businesses. I spent nights building Rose Press's online presence, a simple site with a mission statement that echoed Grandma's spirit stories that shine a light on the forgotten. Each click, each word was a defiance of Lillian's verdict, a step toward proving I was anything but useless. But the hurt was still there, a bruise that ached when I least expected it. I'd drive past Grandma's bookstore, now boarded up, and feel her absence like a physical thing. I'd see Mom counting pennies for groceries and hate myself for not doing more. And I'd think about my aunts and uncles, their smug faces at the will reading, and burn with a need to show them I was more than they'd ever imagined. I wasn't just fighting for me anymore, it was for Grandma's memory, for Mom's sacrifices, for the girl I'd been before they tried to break her. I didn't know it then, but I was already laying the groundwork for a reckoning one that would shake their world to its core. Have you ever carried a hurt so deep it felt like it defined you? What was the moment you decided to turn that pain into power? For me, it was that grant, that website, and the quiet vow I made to Grandma's memory. I'd make them see me not as useless, but as unstoppable. The $5,000 grant was like a match struck in the dark, lighting a path I hadn't dared believe in. I was 25 now, still in Harborview, my days a whirlwind of library shifts, freelance editing, and late-night work on Rose Press. Ellie, my daughter, wasn't born yet. That was a dream for a future. I was only beginning to imagine, but Grandma's stuffed whale sat on my desk, a talisman of her faith in me. The grant money wasn't a fortune, but it was mine, earned through my words, my vision, and it gave me something I'd lost hope. I poured it into Rose Press, buying a domain name, hiring a web designer, and licensing software to streamline my editing work. The website went live a month later, simple but sharp, with a logo I'd sketched myself, a rose blooming from an open book. Every time I saw it, I felt Grandma's hand on my shoulder, her voice whispering, "You've got a spark, Nora." I was still living with Mom, our cottage, a haven, despite its creaks and leaks. She'd come home from teaching, her eyes tired but bright when she saw my laptop glowing with Rosepress's homepage. "You're doing it, Nora," she'd say, her pride, a warmth that eased the ache of my family's betrayal. But money was tighter than ever. The grant had bought me tools, but Mom's reduced hours meant we were scraping by, and my library job and freelance gigs, now bringing in $1,000 a month, weren't enough to cover our bills. I started skipping meals, telling Mom I'd eaten at the library, my stomach twisting with guilt every time she set an extra plate for me. I was fighting for a future, but the present felt like a vice, squeezing tighter each day. Carla, my editor friend, was a godsend. She sent me bigger manuscripts, paying $1,500 for a novel edit, and introduced me to a small press owner named Maya, who ran a feminist publishing house in the city. Maya was tough with a laugh that could shake walls, and she saw something in me. "You've got a knack for finding the heart of a story," she said, during our first video call, her glasses glinting. "Start your press, Nora. I'll mentor you." Her offer was a lifeline, and we started meeting weekly, her advice sharp and practical. How to budget for printing pitch to bookstores, find authors. She sent me to a publishing conference covering my $200 registration fee, and I drove to the city, my heart pounding with nerves and excitement. The conference was a revelation, hundreds of women, sharing stories of breaking into a cutthroat industry, their voices a chorus of defiance. I came home with a notebook full of ideas and a contact list that felt like gold. Rosepress was taking shape, but it was slow, painstaking work. I published my first book, a poetry collection, by a local woman named Lila, whose words about grief and resilience hit me like a mirror. I used the grant money to print 500 copies, selling them online and at the library's community events. The $3,000 profit was small, but it was proof I could do this. I reinvested every cent, hiring a part-time assistant, a college student named Sam, who handled social media for $10 an hour. We built a following, sharing snippets of Lila's poems and stories about Rosepress's mission. Each sale was a brick in a foundation. I was building not just for me, but for Grandma, for Mom, for every voice my family had tried to silence. Mrs. Delaney was my cheerleader, stopping by the library with coffee and praise. "You're making waves, Nora," she'd say, her eyes crinkling. She'd lost her husband years ago, and her stories of rebuilding her life alone gave me strength. "They can't take your spark," she told me one day, echoing Grandma's words. "Not unless you let them." I clung to that, especially when my family's shadow loomed. Aunt Margaret called Mom one evening, her voice dripping with condescension, to update us on the bookstore sale. It fetched $200, she said, as if we should be grateful for the news. The family's splitting it. Mom asked about me, her voice sharp, but Margaret brushed it off. "Nora's not part of this. She's got her little life." I overheard my hands clenching and vowed to make Rosepress bigger than their inheritance, a legacy they couldn't touch. Rachel, my lawyer, was making progress on the trust. She'd found documents showing Grandma's trust was tied to a bank in the city, with assets far larger than the bookstore stocks bonds, even a property I didn't know about. "There's a sealed clause," Rachel said, her voice cautious but excited. "It names a primary heir, but it's locked until a specific date next year." My heart raced. I didn't know if I was the heir, but the possibility was enough to keep me digging. I started saving more aggressively, funneling my freelance earnings into a separate account, now at $10,000. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mom, afraid to jinx it. But I felt it a shift, like the tide turning in my favor. My family didn't let up. One afternoon, I got a text from my cousin, Ethan, Uncle Thomas's son, a smug finance bro who'd smirked at the will reading. "Heard you're playing publisher," he wrote with a laughing emoji. "Stick to the library, Nora. You're out of your league. I stared at the message, my anger a live wire, but instead of replying, I opened my laptop and pitched Rose Press to a regional bookstore chain. They ordered 200 copies of Lila's poetry, a $5,000 deal that felt like a middle finger to Ethan's taunt. I was learning to channel my hurt into action, to let their cruelty fuel my rise. The real breakthrough came when I applied for another grant, this one for $20,000, aimed at women-owned businesses. I spent weeks on the proposal, weaving in my story Grandma's bookstore, my family's rejection, my vision for Rose Press, as a haven for forgotten voices. Submitting it felt like bearing my soul, but Carla and Maya coached me through the nerves. Own your story, Nora Maya said. It's your power. When the email came saying I'd won, I sat on my bedroom floor, tears streaming Grandma's wail in my lap. $20,000 was a game-changer money for more books. A marketing push, maybe even a tiny office. I told Mom that night, and she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. You're unstoppable, she said, and for the first time I believed her. But success didn't erase the pain. I'd drive by Grandma's bookstore, now a vacant lot, and feel a physical ache like part of me had been torn away. I'd see Mom's tired eyes and hate that I couldn't fix everything yet. And I'd think about Lillian Margaret Thomas, their smug certainty that I was nothing, and burn with a need to prove them wrong. Rose Press was growing, but it was still small, a seedling in a storm. I kept working, kept saving, kept digging into the trust driven by a fire that was part anger, part love, part promise. To Grandma's memory. I didn't know it then, but I was building more than a business. I was building a reckoning one that would make my family see me for who I really was. Have you ever turned your pain into something bigger? Something that proved you were more than they said? What was the first victory that made you believe in yourself again? For me, it was that $20,000 grant the moment I knew. Rose Press wasn't just a dream, but a weapon I'd wield to rewrite my story. The $20,000 grant was a turning point, a gust of wind catching the sails of Rose Press and propelling me forward. I was 25 still in Harborview, my life a delicate balance of library work, freelance editing, and building a publishing company from the ground up. Grandma's stuffed whale sat on my desk, a silent witness to my late-night hustle, its worn fabric, a reminder of her belief in my spark. The grant money transformed Rose Press from a scrappy dream into something tangible, a website with thousands of visitors, a second book in the works, a small but fierce team. But the ache of my family's rejection, Lillian's "you're useless," Nora still lingered, a bruise that pulsed with every step I took. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a shield, a sword, a legacy to prove them wrong. I poured the grant into Rose Press, hiring a graphic designer, Leah, to refresh our branding, and a part-time publicist, Amara, to pitch our books to bigger markets. We published our second title, a memoir by a retired nurse named Gloria, whose stories of working-class resilience sold 1,000 copies in a month, netting $10,000. I reinvested every cent printing more books, running ads, and securing a $15,000 contract with a regional library system to distribute our titles. Sam, my assistant, was now full-time managing orders and social media with a knack that made our Instagram glow. Rose Press was small, but mighty a beacon for authors who'd been overlooked just like me. Each sale, each review, felt like a defiance of my family's verdict, a step toward the future I'd promised Grandma. Mom was my rock, her pride, a quiet strength. She'd sit with me at the cottage's kitchen table, her grading papers pushed aside, and listen as I talked about Rose Press's growth. "You're making Rose's dream come true," she'd say, her eyes shining. But her health was faltering, stress, long hours, and a lingering cough she brushed off as just a cold. I insisted she see a doctor, paying for it with my freelance earnings now at $2,000 a month. The diagnosis was bronchitis, treatable, but a warning to slow down. I hated that I couldn't take her burden yet, that our cottage's mortgage still loomed. I started working harder, taking on extra editing jobs, my savings climbing to $25,000 in a secret account I'd opened for Rose Press and the trust investigation. Maya, my mentor, was a force of nature. Our video calls were like boot camps, her voice sharp with challenge. "You're not just a publisher, Nora," she'd say. "You're a movement. Act like it." She pushed me to pitch Rose Press to national bookstores, to think beyond Harborview. I was terrified, but did it driving to the city for meetings with chains like Barnes & Noble, my second-hand blazer hiding my nerves. One buyer, a woman named Priya, loved our mission and ordered 500 copies of Gloria's memoir, a $12,000 deal. It was my first big win, and I celebrated alone in my car, tears streaming, Grandma's wail on the passenger seat. I wasn't just surviving, I was rising. Rachel, my lawyer, kept digging into Grandma's trust. She'd found more documents confirming it held assets worth millions, stocks, a rental property, and a mysterious reserve fund. The sealed clause naming a primary heir was set to open in 6 months, on the 2nd anniversary of Grandma's death. "If you're the heir," Rachel said, her voice cautious, "it could change everything. But you need to be ready for a fight." I nodded, my heart racing. I didn't know if Grandma had chosen me, but the possibility was a fire in my chest. I started researching trusts myself, spending nights at the library poring over legal texts. My savings grew to $40,000, bolstered by a $20 editing contract for a novel series. I was preparing not just for the trust, but for the war I knew my family would wage. Mrs. Delaney saw the change in me. "You're glowing, Nora," she said one day, catching me drafting a grant proposal at the library. I'd applied for another, this one for $50,000, to expand Rose Press into audiobooks and translations. She sat with me, sharing stories of her own battles, losing her husband, raising a son alone, teaching kids who reminded her of me. "You're not just fighting for yourself," she said. "You're fighting for everyone who's been told they're not enough." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that Rose Press was bigger than my pain, a mission to lift others as I lifted myself. My family, of course, tried to cut me down. One sunny afternoon, I ran into Aunt Lillian at the post office, her designer purse gleaming. She looked me up and down, her lip curling. "Still playing with your little books?" she asked, her voice venomous. "Don't embarrass Rose's memory, Nora." I wanted to scream about Rose Press, the grants, the bookstore deals, but I held back, my jaw tight. "I'm honoring her," I said, my voice steady. She laughed sharp and cruel and walked away. That night, I channeled my rage into a new pitch, landing a $25,000 contract with a university to publish a poetry anthology. Lillian's scorn was fuel pushing me to build faster, higher, stronger. The $50,000 grant came through 3 months later, a miracle that left me sobbing in my bedroom, Mom's arms around me. "You're doing it, baby," she whispered, her voice thick. "The money let me hire a sound engineer for audiobooks, translate Lila's poetry into Spanish, and rent a tiny office in Harborview, a one-room space with a view of the ocean. I hung Grandma's wail on the wall, a symbol of the spark she'd seen in me. Rose Press's revenue hit $100,000 that year, with 5,000 books sold and a waiting list of authors. I was invited to speak at a women's publishing conference, a $5,000 honorarium attached, and I said yes, my nerves outweighed by a fire, to share my story. The conference was a whirlwind, a sea of women who'd fought their own battles. I spoke about Grandma, about being called useless, about building Rose Press from pain and promise. The applause was deafening, but it was the women who approached me, after tears in their eyes. Stories like mine that stayed with me. "You gave me hope," one said, and I hugged her, my own tears falling. I came home with new contacts, a $30,000 contract from a feminist press, and a sense that I wasn't just Nora anymore. I was a voice, a force, a woman who'd turned her wounds into wings. But the shadow of my family loomed. Ethan, my cousin, emailed me a week later, his tone mocking. "Saw your little speech online," he wrote. "Cute, but you're still nobody." I didn't reply, but his words stung, a reminder. of the will reading the bookstore sale, the trust they thought they'd claimed. Rachel's latest update gave me hope the trust's assets were valued at $8 million, and the sealed clause was weeks away from opening. I poured my energy into Rose Press My Savings, now at $75,000, preparing for whatever came next. I didn't know it then, but I was on the edge of a reckoning one that would make my family face the useless girl they'd tried to erase. Have you ever felt a victory that wasn't just yours, but for everyone who believed in you? What was the moment you knew you were building something unstoppable? For me, it was that conference stage, the grant, the office with Grandma's wail, and the knowledge that I was ready to claim what was mine, no matter what my family threw at me. The conference speech was a spark that set Rose Press ablaze, and in the months that followed, I felt like I was running on a current of pure determination. I was 26 now, still in Harborview, but no longer the girl who'd been crushed by Lillian's "You're useless, Nora." My tiny office by the ocean was a hive of activity, with Sam, Leah, and Amara turning Rose Press into a name that echoed beyond our small town. We'd published 5 books, sold 10,000 copies, and cleared $200,000 in revenue numbers that made my head spin. My savings had climbed to $150,000, bolstered by a $40,000 contract with a national women's magazine to co-publish a short story anthology. Grandma's wail hung on the office wall, its faded eyes watching me build the legacy she'd always believed in. But the pain of my family's betrayal was a shadow I couldn't outrun, a reminder that my fight wasn't just for me, but for Grandma, for Mom, for every moment they'd tried to make me feel small. Rose Press was more than a business now. It was a movement. Our book stories of resilience from voices like mine were stocked in bookstores across the state, and we'd started a podcast, Untold Stories, that hit 50,000 downloads in its first month. I hired a producer, a sharp woman named Jada, who brought a fire to our audio projects. The $50,000 grant had fueled our audiobook launch, with Lila's poetry now in English and Spanish, selling 2,000 copies at $15 each. I poured the profits back into the press, funding a new novel by a single mom from a fishing town like Harborview. Each book felt like a brick in a fortress, a defiance of the family who'd called me useless. I was invited to speak at another conference, this one in New York, with a $10,000 fee, and I said yes, my heart pounding at the chance to take Rose Press National. Mom was my anchor, her health slowly improving with medication and rest. She'd visit the office, her eyes wide at the stacks of books, the hum of our team. "You're changing the world," Nora, she'd say, her voice thick with pride, but the cottage's mortgage still loomed, and her part-time teaching barely covered her bills. I paid what I could, my freelance editing now at $3,000 a month, but I felt the weight of not doing enough. I started skipping sleep, working through the night, my laptop a constant companion. Mom noticed her brow furrowing. "Don't burn out, baby," she'd say, but I couldn't stop. Every contract, every book was a step toward proving I was more than my family's verdict. Maya, my mentor, kept me sharp. "You're not just a publisher, Nora," she'd say. During our calls, her voice a challenge. "You're a leader. Start acting like one." She pushed me to pitch Rose Press to major distributors, a terrifying leap that paid off when a national chain ordered 1,000 copies of our anthology, a $25,000 deal. I drove to the city for the signing, my hands steady, despite the butterflies in my stomach. The buyer, a woman named Elena, shook my hand and said, "You're doing something special, Nora. Keep going." I knotted my throat tight and drove home with tears in my eyes, Grandma's wail on the passenger seat. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a name one my family couldn't ignore. Rachel, my lawyer, was closing in on the trust. The sealed clause was set to open in a month on the second anniversary of Grandma's death, and she'd confirmed the trust's value, $8 million in assets, including stocks, a rental property, and a cash reserve. The clause names a primary heir, she said, her voice electric. "I can't access it yet, but there's a reference to Rose's chosen, "And I think it's you." My heart stopped. I didn't dare believe it, but the possibility was a fire in my veins. I'd been researching trusts, learning about legal battles, and my savings now, at $200,000, were a war chest for whatever came next. Rachel warned me my family would fight, especially Lillian, who'd been managing the trust's smaller distributions. I didn't care. I was ready, my anger honed into a blade. Mrs. Delaney saw the steel in me. "You're a force, Nora," she said one day, dropping by the office with a new book. She'd started volunteering with our community readings, her voice bringing our author's words to life. "They tried to break you, but you're stronger than they'll ever know," she said, her eyes fierce. I hugged her, grateful for her belief, for the way she saw me as more than the girl who'd cried in her diner. She told me about her son, now a teacher like her, and I realized I was fighting for people like them too. People who'd been overlooked but never stopped dreaming. My family didn't let up. One evening I got a call from Aunt Margaret, her voice cold as ever. "We're finalizing the trust distributions," she said. "Don't expect anything, Nora. You're not entitled." I gripped the phone, my anger flaring. "We'll see about that," I said, my voice low but firm. She laughed a sound that cut deep and hung up. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and pitched Rose Press to a major podcast network, landing a $50,000 sponsorship deal. Margaret's dismissal was fuel pushing me to build faster, to make Rose Press a name that would outshine their greed. The New York conference was a game changer. I spoke on a panel about women in publishing sharing my story. Grandma's bookstore, the will reading The Rise of Rose Press. The room was packed, 500 people, hanging on my words, and when I finished, the applause was a roar. A literary agent approached me after offering to represent Rose Press for a potential book deal about my journey. I said yes, my hands shaking, and came home with a $75,000 advance offer and a dozen new client leads. Rose Press's revenue hit $500,000 that year with 20,000 books sold and a team of 8. I rented a bigger office, a 2-room space with a view of Harborview's lighthouse, and hung Grandma's whale in the center, a symbol of the spark that had carried me this far. But the trust loomed a storm on the horizon. Rachel's latest update was a bombshell, the trust's rental property. A commercial building in the city was worth $3 million alone, and the sealed clause was tied to a letter Grandma had written to be read publicly at the opening. "If you're the heir," Rachel said, "you'll need to be there in person, with proof of your work." I nodded, my mind racing. I started preparing, gathering documents, Rose Press's contracts, my grants, the conference speeches. My savings climbed to $300, bolstered by a $100,000 contract with a university press. I was ready for the fight, my heart a mix of fear and fire. Lillian tried one last jab before the trust opening. She showed up at the library, her fur coat out of place among the stacks. "I hear you're still playing publisher," she said, her voice venomous. "Don't think it changes who you are, Nora. You're nothing." I looked at her, my spine straight, and said, "I'm everything Grandma believed in. You'll see." She flinched, unaccustomed to my defiance, and left her heels clicking like a retreating army. That night, I wrote a speech for the trust opening, pouring my heart into every word, knowing it could be my chance to reclaim Grandma's legacy and my own. Have you ever stood on the edge of a moment that could change everything? What was the strength that carried you forward, even when the world tried to pull you back? For me, it was Grandma's wail, Rose Press's rise, and the fire in my chest that said I was done being useless. I was ready to claim what was mine, and no one could stop me. The trust opening was set for a cold gray morning in March, exactly 2 years after Grandma's death, and I woke with a fire in my chest that burned through my nerves. I was 26, no longer the broken girl who'd been turned away from the will reading, but Nora Harlan, CEO of Rose Press, a woman who'd built a $500,000 publishing empire from pain and promise. The past 2 years had been a crucible, Lillian's "You're useless, Nora," a wound I'd turned into a weapon. Grandma's wail, a beacon, guiding me through the storm. Today was the reckoning, the moment I'd either claim Grandma's legacy or face my family's final attempt to erase me. I dressed carefully, a tailored blazer, over a dress Mom had sewn my hands steady, as I tucked the trust documents and Rose Press's portfolio into my bag. I was ready, not just for the trust, but for the truth, whatever it held. I drove to the city, the harbor fading in my rear view, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and defiance. The trust opening was at a law firm in a sleek downtown building, all glass and steel, a world away from Harborview's weathered cottages. Rachel met me in the lobby, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "You've got this, Nora," she said, handing me a copy of Grandma's sealed letter. Its envelope yellowed but unopened. The clause names the heir, and the letter explains why. "Your family's already here. They don't know what's coming." I knotted my throat tight and followed her to a conference room where my aunts, uncles, and cousins sat around a polished table, their faces a mix of greed and disdain. Lillian was at the head, her fur coat draped over her chair, her eyes narrowing as I walked in. "What's she doing here?" she hissed, but the lawyer, a stern woman named Ms. Carter, raised a hand. "Nora has a right to be here," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Let's begin." The room was silent as Ms. Carter opened the trust's sealed clause, her voice steady as she read. The primary heir to the Rose Harlan Trust, valued at $8 million, was Nora Harlan, granddaughter, chosen for her dedication to stories and resilience in the face of adversity. A gasp rippled through the room, followed by Lillian's scream. "That's impossible. She's nothing." My cousins, Ethan, Sophie, and Clara, stared, their faces pale, while Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas whispered furiously. I stood, my heart racing but my voice calm. "It's not impossible," I said, meeting Lillian's gaze. "It's Grandma's choice. Mrs. Carter handed me the letter, and I opened it, my hands trembling as I read Grandma's words aloud. "Nora, my spark, you've carried my love for stories forward. This trust is yours to build a legacy that shines. Forgive them, but don't let them dim you." The room erupted. Lillian lunged forward, her face red. She tricked Rose. "She's a fraud," Ethan shouted about lawsuits Sophie muttered about. "Unfair," and Margaret clutched her pearls as if I'd stolen their birthright. But Ms. Carter was unmoved, presenting documents proving the trust's assets: $3 million in stocks, a $3 million rental property, $2 million in cash were mine effective immediately. I'd brought my portfolio, a thick binder of Rose Press's contracts, grants, and speeches, and I slid it across the table. "This is what I've built," I said, my voice ringing. "While you called me useless, I created a publishing company that's touched thousands of lives. Grandma saw it. You didn't." The confrontation was electric, every word a release of the pain I'd carried. Lillian tried to interrupt, but I cut her off. "You barred me from her will, sold her bookstore, called me nothing. But I'm the one Grandma chose because I honored her, not her money." Ethan stood, his face twisted. "You'll never keep this, Nora. We'll fight you." I smiled, something fierce rising in me. "Try it. I've got a lawyer, a business, and the truth." Rachel stepped forward, her presence a shield, and handed them a legal notice. Any challenge to the trust would be met with proof of their mismanagement of Grandma's smaller distributions, a scandal they couldn't afford. The room fell silent, their bravado crumbling. Sophie looked away. Claire's hands shook, and Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not of remorse but defeat. Lillian was last to break, her voice low. "You think this makes you better than us?" I shook my head, Grandma's letter in my hand. "It makes me free." I walked out, Rachel at my side, the weight of $8 million, and Grandma's love settling into my bones. The trust was mine, not just the money, but the validation, the proof that I'd been enough all along. The news spread like wildfire. A local paper ran a story: Harborview woman inherits $8 trust, and Rose Press's website crashed from traffic. I was invited to speak at a National Women's Summit, a $15,000 fee attached, and my TEDx talk from the New York conference hit 5 million views. Clients flooded in, pushing Rose Press's revenue to $1 million with 30,000 books sold and a team of 12. My family didn't apologize. Lillian sent a curt email threatening legal action, but Rachel shut it down, citing the trust's ironclad terms. Ethan and Sophie went quiet, their social media posts about family betrayal ignored by a public that saw me as a hero. Margaret called Mom, her voice trembling, but Mom hung up. "They don't get to rewrite this," she said, her pride in me a fire of its own. David, my boyfriend, was a quiet strength through it all. We'd met at the library a year ago, a shy writer whose poetry I'd published. He'd been at the trust opening waiting outside, and when I emerged, he pulled me into a hug, his voice soft. "You did it, Nora. You're unstoppable." I hadn't realized how much I needed his belief until that moment, a reminder that love could be a partner, not a cage. We drove home together, the city fading into Harborview's salt air, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't just free of my family, I was free of the doubt they'd planted in me. The summit speech was the public crescendo. I stood on a stage in front of 2,000 women, my blazer-sharp grandma's wail tucked in my bag. I told my story, the will reading the trust, the rise of Rose Press. I spoke of Grandma's spark, Mom's sacrifices, the women like Maya and Mrs. Delaney who'd lifted me up. They called me useless. I said, my voice steady, but I built a legacy from their rejection. You can too. The applause was a roar, but it was the women who mobbed me, after sharing their own stories of being underestimated, that broke my heart open. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. Have you ever faced a moment where the world saw you for who you truly are? What was it like to stand in your power, knowing no one could take it away? For me, it was that stage, that trust the letter in Grandma's handwriting, and the knowledge that I'd turned useless into a victory they'd never forget. The trust opening was a seismic shift, like the world tilting to right a wrong that had festered too long. I was 26, no longer defined by Lillian's "You're useless, Nora," but as Nora Harlan, CEO of Rose Press, heir to an $8 million trust, and a woman who'd turned rejection into a legacy. The weeks after that confrontation were a whirlwind. Rose Press's revenue soared past $1 million with 50,000 books sold and a team of 15 humming in our Ocean View office. My savings now at $500,000 after new contracts sat in a trust of my own, a safeguard for the future. Grandma's wail hung in the office, a symbol of the spark she'd seen in me, but the weight of her letter, "Forgive them, but don't let them dim you," was a question I hadn't answered. Could I forgive? Did I even want to? I'd won, but victory doesn't erase the scars. It just gives you a place to stand while you decide what comes next. I moved out of Mom's cottage, renting a small house in Harborview with a porch overlooking the sea. It was modest, but it was mine, a space where I could breathe without the shadow of my family's cruelty. Mom came with me. Her teaching hours stabilized her health stronger with rest and care. We'd sit on the porch, her hand in mine, and talk about Grandma, about Rose Press, about the life we were building. "You've made me so proud," she'd say, her eyes wet, and I'd hug her grateful for the woman who'd never let me believe I was less than enough. I paid off the cottage's mortgage with trust funds, gifting it to Mom as a thank you for her sacrifices. She cried, and so did I. Our tears, a mix of relief and love, a reminder that some bonds are stronger than greed. Rose Press was a beacon, now its name synonymous with stories that mattered. We published 10 books that year, including a novel by a young woman from a factory town that hit bestseller lists, earning $200,000 in royalties. Our podcast grew to 100,000 downloads a month, and we launched a scholarship program funding $10,000 annually for aspiring writers from small towns like Harborview. I named it the Rose Harlan Award, a tribute to Grandma's belief in overlooked voices. At the first ceremony, I stood on a community center stage, Mom and Mrs. Delaney in the front row, and handed a check to a shy girl whose poetry reminded me of myself. "Your story matters." I told her, my voice thick, and the applause was a warmth that filled the holes my family had left. David was my partner in every sense, his quiet strength a contrast to the chaos of my rise. He'd moved in with me, his poetry now published by Rose Press, and we'd spend evenings writing together, his words a mirror to my own. "You've changed the world, Nora," he'd say, his hand brushing mine, and I'd smile, knowing he meant my world too. We talked about marriage, about a family, but I wasn't in a rush. I was savoring the present, the life I'd built from pain and promise. David joined me at speaking gigs, his pride a steady anchor. The TEDx talk had led to a book deal, a memoir titled Spark Undimmed with a $150,000 advance. Writing it was like excavating my soul, each chapter a step toward understanding who I'd become. My family didn't vanish, though I wished they would. Lillian's threatened lawsuit never materialized. Rachel's evidence of their trust mismanagement was a guillotine they couldn't dodge. Ethan and Sophie went silent, their social media accounts private after public backlash to their poor Nora posts. Aunt Margaret sent a letter, her tone stiff but pleading, asking to reconnect as family. I didn't respond. Uncle Thomas called Mom, his voice trembling, but she cut him off. "You lost her when you called her useless," she said, and hung up. I didn't need their apologies, their excuses, their sudden interest now that I held $8 million and a name they couldn't ignore. Grandma's letter had asked for forgiveness, but I wasn't there yet. Maybe I never would be. What I felt was release, a letting go of the need for their validation, a freedom to define my worth on my terms. The trust's assets reshaped my world. The $3 million rental property, a sleek building in the city, generated $200,000 a year in income, which I funneled into Rose Press and the scholarship. The $3 million in stocks grew under a financial advisor's care, and the $2 million cash reserve was a safety net for Mom, David, and me. I bought Grandma's old bookstore lot vacant since the sale for $250,000 and started plans to rebuild it as a Rose Press community center, a place for readings, workshops, and dreams. The groundbreaking was set for next year, and I could already see Grandma's smile in the blueprints, her spark alive in every beam. The public saw me differently now. The summit speech had gone viral with 10 million views, and I was flooded with offers, TV interviews, consulting gigs, a guest professorship at a university. Rose Press's revenue hit $2 million with 100,000 books sold and a team of 20. We opened a second office in the city, a glass-walled space where I hung a replica of Grandma's whale, a nod to the original in Harborview. I spoke at the UN Women's Conference, a $25,000 honorarium in my pocket, and told a crowd of $5,000 that resilience is a choice, a fire you stoke when the world tries to douse you. The standing ovation was deafening, but it was the letters from viewers, women who'd been called useless and found strength in my story, that broke my heart open. I didn't forgive my family, not in the way Grandma might have hoped. Forgiveness felt like giving them power they didn't deserve, a softening of the edges they'd sharpened against me. Instead, I let go, releasing their hold on my heart. I didn't need their regret to move forward. I had Mom's love, David's partnership, Mrs. Delaney's wisdom, Maya's mentorship, Rachel's loyalty. I had Rose Press, a $1 million empire, built from a $5,000 grant, and a girl's refusal to break. And I had Grandma's trust, not just the money, but her belief, her letter, her spark that had carried me through the dark. I started a tradition, a small but powerful one. Every year on Grandma's birthday, I'd visit her grave, a quiet spot overlooking the harbor, and read her letter aloud, my voice steady against the wind. "You saw me," I'd say, the whale tucked in my bag. "I'm shining for you." Then I'd drive to the bookstore lot soon to be a center for dreamers, and lay a rose on the ground, a symbol of the legacy we'd built together. The final message I carry, the one I share with you now, is this: your worth doesn't depend on someone else's validation. You are enough not because of what you own or what they say, but because you choose to rise to shine to claim the spark inside you. Have you ever found a way to let go of the pain others caused, not for them, but for you? What's the legacy you're building, the one that says you're enough? For me, it's Rose Press, the bookstore rising from ashes, the whale on my wall, and the knowledge that I turned useless into a light that will never dim. I'm Nora, and this is my story, not the end, but a beginning. One I share with you because you're fighting your own battles, and I believe in your spark too.